Now, the agriculture sector, like so many others, has been far from untouched by COVID-19. Even though the supply chain is categorized as essential services during the lockdown period, there was quite a lot of impact on this sector. We're looking at the future now. What does the future of agriculture hold, and what's going to be the future for food security in Africa? Now, joining me on this discussion is Wandile Sihlobo, the Chief Economist at Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa, Christo van der Rheede, Deputy Executive Director for AGRI SA. Also joining us from Lagos, Nigeria, is Osakwe, the CEO of Nuli Juice, and Kola Masha, the MD at Babban Gona. Before we start, let's have a quick look at some of the stats from 2017. It may be a year or two out, but certainly there's a lot to say for this one. There you are. So commercial farming in South Africa alone, there's more than 40,000 commercial farmers, and every year they generate on 46 million hectares of land, which is 38% of the total, and they generate 332 more than billion rand in commercial agriculture. Now, animals make up more than half of the farming income of 295 billion. That's 52%, as you can spot there, followed by horticulture and crops. And these are some of the top crops here: maize, sugarcane, oranges, lucerne, grapes, wheat, apples, maize, soya beans. So looking now at the sort of animals we have: cattle, sheep, pigs, goats, ostriches, wildebeest, kudu, horses, impala and springbok. We've certainly got it all here in South Africa. And now just look at the GDP from agriculture here. Look at Nigeria there in the blue and South Africa in the green, and you can see South Africa starting to drop off significantly come July 2018, recovers a bit. Nigeria drops off as well from that time, but managed to recover towards the end of 2019. But as you can see, January 2020, even before COVID, South African agriculture was indeed struggling. But I've just got to start going around our panel here, starting with you, Christo. Just give us an idea of how hard COVID-19 has hit agriculture.
I think agriculture in South Africa is in a quite fortunate position in that it was declared as an essential service. So farmers have continued to farm, and they've continued to produce to local markets and as well as international markets. I think the biggest challenge for agriculture in South Africa is the issue of drought. Some areas we continue to experience major drought, and that at the end of the day also makes it very difficult for those farmers to survive financially. But overall, I think South Africa is still in a very, very good place, especially in terms of export-driven products, as well as supplies of local products at this point in time.
Okay, if I go to you, Kola, in Lagos as well, just to get the perspective from West Africa. Just a couple of, first and foremost, in some ways, West Africa should be in a good place when it comes to agriculture. I mean, the current head of the African Development Bank is the former agriculture minister, a man who grew up on the land in Nigeria. And just on that point as well, just before we move on and give us the picture there, I mean, Mr. Akinwumi Adesina, he's under a bit of pressure at the moment here. What's your take on what's happening?
Well, I think, I had the pleasure of working for Mr. Adesina while he was Minister of Agriculture as one of his senior advisors. And I can tell you, hands down, I have not met somebody that is as committed to the development of the African continent as his. His ability, his exceptional leadership and work ethic while I worked with him was really paramount, above most any other leaders that I've interacted with. I think the reality is that what we've seen happening at the African Development Bank is unfortunate. The reality is, I think with the recent announcement by the Board of Governors, where they have reaffirmed their belief in standing by the ethics committee. However, they have opened up an opportunity for an independent review of the ethics committee's processes. I think will really, at the end of the day, very quickly put this challenge to bed.
And quickly, aside from all of that, agriculture in West Africa, we've been hearing in Southern Africa, or particularly South Africa, it's looking fairly healthy under the circumstances. What about in your region?
Well, I think the reality is the agriculture sector in Nigeria has gone through a few quarters, challenging quarters. I think we've seen the sector has been hands down for the last 10 years been the key growth driver for GDP, particularly in Nigeria. We've seen 5.5% growth year on year in that sector. However, we have seen a dip in that growth recently, even pre-COVID. Now, the reality is, in terms of the timing of this COVID challenge in West Africa, the reality it's come at a time right before planting. So what we've seen in the sector is a significant impact in terms of the supply chain, particularly for agricultural inputs like fertilizer. The unfortunate reality is we may see a dip in productivity this season because of impact and the limited supply of inputs.
And if I can come to you, Ada Osakwe, also in Lagos there, you're in the supply chain very much. I mean, you take and you process raw fruit and you make it into your drinks. How did COVID-19, how hard did it hit you?
It's hit very hard, Chris. As Kola mentioned, the supply chain has been hit tremendously. And it's not only about the inputs going to the farmers, but it's how the farmers even get what they had even harvested already to the markets, to processors like ourselves. With the lockdowns, there have been double the cost of logistics has increased for those who are bringing things out to the urban areas. And you're just finding a situation that people aren't buying from the demand side. So like you mentioned earlier, Chris, that even though food is an essential service, even as a restaurant, as a beverage producer, we're still able to open up our stores for deliveries. Unfortunately, people have been so conscious about what they buy. So we have seen over an 80% drop in our revenues. Of our 10 stores, we only have one that was open. So it's been a difficult time, but we just have to keep pushing.
And if I can come to you now, Wandile, talking about sometimes how vulnerable our food supply can be in difficult times. Gauteng, this province that we're sitting in right now, it produces over a third of all of South Africa's carrots. But I'm told by people on the inside in agriculture that a change in the weather can absolutely devastate, an important crop like that. I mean, how vulnerable is the food in the ground sometimes?
Yeah. No, Chris, obviously from the weather side, if you are in agriculture, you are dependent on the climatic conditions. So that's one of the things that is important. But as Christo in the starting point has said, I mean, we are fortunate in South Africa. COVID-19 comes at a time where the season has advanced, but not only advanced, but we're also expecting record harvest. I was looking at the numbers you had on the chart at the start there with South Africa underperforming in as far as the GDP. But if you look through the year, we're looking at a 10% recovery in South Africa's agricultural fortunes this year. So we are having a great time in as far as production in a macro level. But obviously, there are certain subsectors, Chris. You think about the wine industry, you think about the tobacco industry, cotton, those are not enjoying as the bigger drive as the broader subsectors of agriculture. But on a point you are raising of the weather, it's a climatic condition and it's something that we'll need to think about, both from a technology on a seed breeding side, but also on the farmers on adaptation as we go forward to produce. And unfortunately, it will be with us for quite some time. So we need to think about the ways of adjusting to that.
Well, just a bit of a quick supplementary there. I mean, you said you got the nail on the head there. Tobacco and wine, two huge industries in sub-Saharan Africa, not just in South Africa. They must be absolutely bleeding right now with the restrictions and the depression of demand so far.
For the wine industry, yes, but fortunately now they are back onto business. But obviously there are losses that have been incurred over the past couple of weeks. For tobacco industry, I mean, it's still a long process. The hope is that with some of the funds that in South Africa have been part of the relief side, tobacco industry wasn't listed there, but the hope is that in the sum of the capital that is yet to be spent, there could be adjustments to sustain those producers so that whenever the changes in legislations are made at a later stage, we can still have the farming community, we can still have a manufacturing sector that will be performing. And I mean, agriculture post-COVID-19 is going to be one of the sectors that will help us on driving the economic growth. So we need to put the building blocks while we still have time.
Christo, so there's been a lot of talk. You say that the rains have fallen and the industry is looking okay, but especially you were saying citrus exports to the Far East are likely to be pretty healthy at the moment. But what ultimately there's likely to be job losses. Have you done any work yet on how many people we might lose in the industry here?
That is very difficult to estimate because a large chunk of our workforce are doing seasonal work. So it depends on the season, but we've seen huge employment in the citrus fruit industry over the last part of the 2019. In the citrus fruit industry, also a large number of people are being employed. I think the bigger challenge is within the rest of the industry. Because as Wandile has said, on the supply side, we're doing quite well. But on the demand side, you know, restaurants have been closed down, shops have seen limited uptake of a range of products, and most people went for non-perishable goods right at the start of the lockdown. But I believe that due to the fact that agriculture is in a good space at this point in time, there will be even more job opportunities being created. The bigger challenge, obviously, is within our drought-stricken areas where farmers are experiencing a liquidity crunch, and there we've seen large numbers of workers losing out on jobs. The bigger challenge, however, lies at a logistical level. We've seen diesel shortages in South Africa, a problem with the supply of diesel and the pipeline, the transit pipeline being sabotaged. And I hope government will step up to the challenge and make sure that there's full restoration of that pipeline. And then we've also seen challenges within our harbors, workers, work stoppages, etc., due to the fact there was an outbreak of COVID-19 cases. But overall, I think in terms of the job losses for me lies with other sectors, such as the tourism sector and other sectors that are still under lockdown. And that's where the bigger problem lies for South Africa.
Just one other quick question. I mean, everyone across the continent will be grappling with this, no doubt. I mean, how do you do social distancing when you're gathering crops on this continent?
I think the agricultural sector overall has done quite well because farmers realized that they cannot afford their farms or their processing plants being closed down due to a COVID outbreak. So they went the extra mile to ensure that all the necessary precautionary measures are put in place. So, but still, we still face a particular risk in the sector. But up to now, the sector have done quite well to ensure to protect themselves from the further spread of the virus within the workplace. But I tell you, people are so innovative in the South African context. They find ways to minimize contact between people and to ensure that people are immediately assisted if they show any symptoms of COVID or any other disease.
And if I can go back to Lagos now and Kola, in West Africa, you are struggling to keep up with your agricultural exports at the moment, according to the figures. How do you think that could be eased at all?
Well, I think the reality is we have, as Adam mentioned, the logistics in country have been hampered due to the lockdown. Particularly, we've seen interstate travel during this period particularly hampered. However, the good news is that is easing up now. The ports are starting to get to gear back up, so we do expect that is a relatively temporary impact.
And I see in Côte d'Ivoire, some of the domestic cocoa export levies are being reduced to try to encourage exports. Could that not be repeated in other commodities?
Well, I think it is potentially an option, but I think we have to go back to why some of these levies were put in place originally, right? Fundamentally, if you look at the cocoa sector, the cocoa farmer gets a really tiny fraction of the value created in the industry. I think as countries, Ivory Coast is the major exporter, only gets about 8% of the profits that are generated in the entire sector. So I think there's an opportunity to kind of rebalance that equation and help drive development and create the capital necessary to make the investments that I think in the long run will make the sector much, much more sustainable.
And Ada, I mean, all of this must be causing great disruption for your business in Lagos as well. And it's if I recall, it's quite a young business. What sort of measures are you having to put in, not only to protect your workers from COVID-19, but also to try to keep the business running?
It's a very interesting one. As Kola mentioned, we haven't really been processing in Nigeria when it comes to agriculture. So even as we think about things, we had been importing a lot of food. So over $40 billion annually, Africa in general, Nigeria, a big part of that, importing food. So even if we increase our productivity, and the numbers you showed earlier on was an increased productivity of agriculture, we don't have enough processing plants to take that to turn those into food products. So that has been a big issue for us. But as I think about my business and that supply chain that's critical for us to keep going, and the fact that there have been lockdowns, it's pretty much exposed the gaps in our food security and the need to increasingly look local. We have to not only grow local, but we have to process locally and we have to consume locally. So we have to have the food products that do that. And for my business, increasingly, even though we have been local buyers, the lockdowns, the interstate problems, and the resulting increases of food prices and our raw materials has made us look internally into the urban cities we live in. So how do we think about greening our cities and not depending only on the parts of the country, mostly in the rural areas, that grow food? So increasingly, we are having to look at that sort of alternative of making sure we can start sourcing more from precision farming techniques, using technology to farm, and finding ways to get our produce right here in urban cities as well.
And if I could come to you, Wandile, as well, in terms of this end of the continent, it's quite a big task still that farmers face in the future. I mean, with the World Food Programme saying something like 40 million Africans, like that's an entire nation, are in need of food at the moment. How do you think the agriculture industry here in sub-Saharan Africa can measure up to that challenge?
Yeah, I think, Chris, one of the stories or one of the areas that we will need to look at and begin to embrace in Africa is also the benefits of technology, as we're thinking on this, both but also on the biosecurity side. Because one of the contributing factors to this is also the low levels of productivity. And if you start to look back and say, why do we have this low productivity, and compare maybe various countries, the issues of seeds that are being used begins to be one of the issues. You take, for example, maize. South Africa enjoys all of these capabilities that they are doing. But when you drill down into it, it's the type of seeds that they are using, the investments on technology, mechanization that has actually been made. And I think that if legislation and the policies in the African continent could begin to be more accommodative, genetically modified seeds where possible can be allowed. If we do that, we can at least begin to get some of the grains and some of the food stuff that we need. And that will also allow us to produce more, to participate in a global market. I mean, Ada was talking about Nigeria importing some of the stuff. They spend roughly north of $6 billion a year importing agricultural products. They can be able to substitute those if you look at the profile of what they are importing, but we just need to align some of these things. And I think that the policymakers should be open to that, and there are technologies out there that can come to these countries and assist farmers so that they can produce and get the right seeds and be able to compete competitively in the global market. And I think that's what has been the strength of South Africa. We don't have the best climate compared to many African countries, but we sit here comfortably being the net exporters, and those investments that have been made is one of those things. And I think that that's what the African continent should begin to embrace, particularly as we will be rebuilding post-COVID in the coming months or years, depending on when the vaccine is really available.
Well, we're going to talk in a second about technology, but just one more quick one for you, Wandile. Just give us, in a nutshell, the kind of changes in regulation you'd like to see to try to stimulate the agriculture industry in Africa.
I would like to see, Chris, governments embracing biotechnology in Africa, really being open on that, and particularly on the staple products. We've seen countries like South Africa who have began adopting biotechnology in as early as 2001. If you had to look at how much productivity on a yield side we've seen, it's more than double. And that's what I would like to see in many of the African countries. And I think as soon as that starts to pick up and farmers' incomes pick up, then all of the other mechanical technologies that will be needed, farmers will be able to acquire those. Some of these things don't really need government money, but they will need the government to put the pen on the paper and open up some of the legislation. And this could be the start for agriculture.
Christo, if I come to you, just as we were looking there, some of the beautiful scenes there across the arable fields of Africa. How you have set up a portal, an online portal to help transform the industry, but how do you think the digital world can connect those beautiful fields we saw with the future, you think?
I think farmers at this point in time, especially our commercial farmers, are embracing a lot of technologies. It's absolutely amazing, the use of drones, the use of all kinds of scientific applications and technological applications. It's mind-boggling. And with the help of all of these technologies, farmers in South Africa have been able to improve their yields dramatically. The bigger problem in South Africa is the duality of our system. On the one hand, you've got 40,000 commercial farmers that are responsible for the bigger output, or for the entire output almost of food supply to our consumers. On the other hand, you've got small-scale farmers that are struggling at this point in time, and they are mostly black. And we have to deal with that legacy in a very constructive way. First and foremost, we must ensure that people have, that the land that they work, that land is registered in their names. Because with that registration or that title deed, they will be able to collateralize that land and get access to financing. Remember, South Africa produces its food on the back of production loans. Currently, our total loan facility amounts to almost 200 billion rand, and that needs to be paid back. So technology on the one hand, but you need to put constitutional imperatives in place to ensure that people, when they go to a financial institution, they are able to get a loan on the back of the fact that they can collateralize the land. And then the third aspect, obviously, is infrastructure. Our harbors must work, our road infrastructure must work, and we must ensure that there's safety and security for everyone on the farm. So there's a multi-dimensional approach that is required to ensure successful farming at the end of the day.
Now we're getting close to wrapping up our discussion here, but if I come to you, Kola, in Lagos, as we mentioned earlier in the show, Dr. Adesina of the AFDB, I know one of his dreams was to connect hundreds of thousands of farmers across Nigeria with cell phones so they could make orders, they could sell their products, etc., etc. How is the digital world helping Nigeria to return to being a growing, producing nation?
Well, I think the reality is that there are some fundamental infrastructure challenges that are impeding that growth. I think fundamentally, if you look at Nigeria in particular, the setup of the phone network systems, we privatize the entire system. Typically, what you find in most other countries is that there usually is at least one major phone network provider that is predominantly owned and managed by the government. And what that enables to happen is that these areas that are probably less profitable to invest in, particularly rural communities, still get good coverage. I think fundamentally we still have a significant issue around access to data in many of these rural communities, that once that problem is fixed, I think we will see an incredible digital revolution take off across the agriculture sector here.
Okay, well, we're wrapping up our discussion here, and I go back to Lagos to Ada Osakwe. What gives you hope in this world of COVID-19 for the future of agriculture, not only in Nigeria, but also on the rest of the continent?
You know, I really hope that we use this time to reset and look at the issues that agriculture, that have been facing agriculture for a while. The fact that it's a sector that's still the second largest contributor to climate change. The fact that this is a healthcare crisis right now. It's a health crisis, and food is medicine. And we should be thinking about how to plant the types of foods that improve our nutrition and deal with issues around this. So for me, that gives me hope, because I think increasingly it's brought to light these issues, and we can finally use policy, and with the likes of everyone on this call and the leaders in the sector, basically try to reset and move ourselves onto a brighter path.
So a quick wrap up about the future from you, Wandile?
I'm hopeful about the future, and I think that agriculture should continue to play one of the important sectors as we are rebuilding the economies. Let's find a way of adapting to climate change, and the government needs to be open to ideas that Christo was putting on the board, so that we can draw investments in agriculture, not only here at home, but across the continent.
Christo, final word from you.
Enjoy the good wines from South Africa, and enjoy the very good products from Nigeria. I think on the African continent, the moment we start working together and we start importing and exporting from each other, we will be able to create a beautiful future for all of our people. But we must always do it in harmony with the environment. At the same time, protect our flora and fauna, and at the same time, making sure that the people have enough to eat.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on this discussion on agriculture. We have enough for another hour-long show, I'm sure, which we'll be looking at in the coming weeks. Thank you very much to my guests, Wandile Sihlobo, the Chief Economist at Agriculture Business Chamber South Africa, Christo van der Rheede, the Deputy Executive Director for AGRI SA, also joining us from Lagos, Nigeria, Ada Osakwe, the founder and CEO of Nuli Juice, and Kola Masha, MD at Babban Gona.